In your reading this week, we set aside the diagnosing and changing organizational culture. We're completed our work with Cameron and Quinn, but before we leave them, I do want to encourage you one more time, if that model connects with you, and it connects very deeply with me, this is the next book for you, The Competing Values Leadership, and I recommend it. It is quite technical, but no more so than the book that you just finished. Now, in addition to that, if you'd like other kinds of books that follow this model, that are based on it, this is a fabulous book. Deep Change by Robert Quinn. It's far more popular, it's easier to follow, but he uses the same 4 patterns. And you will see it and see his transformational process. It is excellent. This is the one that I dealt with, and I've shared this with you before when I was working with Dr. Quinn. Another that is quite nice is Change the World, another by Dr. Quinn, in which he looks at spiritual leaders, Jesus, and he looks at Martin Luther King, and he looks at Mahatma Gandhi, and he talks about how we go through a process of bringing real change to the world. And it is based, again, on the model. You'll see it come through in the book. But for those of you that would like more academic and specific help in that area, on that model, I want to recommend this one to you. This is Becoming a Master Manager. It is by Quinn, but many others that are involved in it, and just a tremendous, tremendous book. He deals with the 4 cultures, but he talks about them in 2 roles for each, and then he has about 4 competencies for each one, and it actually goes into depth on how to do and develop each of those competencies. It's a marvelous book, just absolutely marvelous. It's expensive. Look for it in a used section, or online or something, but you'll find that helpful. Now, we are now setting aside Cameron and Quinn, and we pick up again with Edgar Schein. Cameron and Quinn get us into the idea of assessing culture. Schein gets us in over our heads, especially in the next section, which is section 2 that we're going to be looking at this week. I'll walk you through it briefly. If this is helpful to you, you can get your book and follow along. Section 2 actually begins on page 69, and he talks about the structural concepts that he's going to deal with and the content of culture. He talks about the structural analysis of the artifacts, the espoused values, the basic assumptions, and then the content, what is specific to a culture. And notice that he divides it. You'll see this on page 70, second paragraph, the external environment and the internal environment. Now, if you'll notice in the Cameron and Quinn model, the external, the internal is very much a part of their model. And that's the where Schein is talking about it at this point. He says at the bottom of page 71, and I really like this, you could distance yourself somewhat from the stories thus far, but as you read on in his book, you will benefit most. And this is really the key to reading this next section. So underline it, get it, read it this way. You will benefit most from asking yourself in each of the chapters what your own position is on every dimension we will review. Discover the layers of culture within you. And indeed, the next major assignment you will carry out is exactly that. It comes from this book and this section you're reading this week, so that next week you will go through that and ask yourself with others, How do I perceive this dimension of culture? How does the culture itself, how do you see it? And begin to get a grip on that, your personal preference and the culture in which you work. Now, I'll move through this rather quickly. Chapter 5, the external adaptations. How do we deal with the environment? On the top of page 74, he outlines those. Mission and strategy, goals, means, measurement, correction. There's just a lot of things that are very useful here, but you're very capable of reading it, so I'm not going to do that with you. I'm just trying to get you the outline for it. On Chapter 6, which is page 93, he then moves from the outward side, that is, how do we deal with the market, how do we deal with the demands of the environment and that sort of thing, to the internal side. How do we get along with each other? How do we decide who's in and out? Who gets to be part of it? Who gets to be punished? Who gets a say? Who has to be silent? These kinds of issues. And fascinating material as you look at it. And so I invite you to spend some time in that. He outlines it for you on page 94, the common language, the boundaries, the power, trust and intimacy, friendship, rewards and punishments. The last section of this chapter is really his way of talking about faith, explaining the unexplainable. And for those of you thinking about a church, that's going to be an especially interesting section for you to read. Now, from there on out, chapters 7 to 9, he deals with much deeper assumptions. It's almost theological. Don't let the titles and his titles of sections throw you. You know, levels of reality. It sounds like you're reading metaphysics. But get into it and look for the places where you can connect with what he's talking about. It's valuable material. But you can't go too fast. You've got to let it connect with who you are and how you think about things and how it relates to the culture that you're dealing with. And he does all this finally to get to chapter 10, where he talks about why, or he brings it together, he's made his point, why surveys are only partially successful. He actually deals with the Cameron and Quinn survey on page 168 here in his book. But he's saying why you really have to step into the culture. You've got to interact with it. And this takes us back to Kurt Lewin. You don't really know it until you try to change it. But then that's a piece for next week.